Welcome, and thank you everyone for tuning in to our latest Economic Outlook Report with a focus on the economic signals most impacted by COVID-19. This conversation is taking place on Thursday, March 26, 2020. Please welcome Prevadary's Chief Economist, Andrew Jagay, to the conversation. Andrew, we find ourselves here fairly regularly. This week saw some pretty rapid escalation of events from stimulus, market changes, obviously the evolving health crisis. It must be challenging from your perspective to look at this with an economist point of view. Andrew, what can you highlight in terms of where we should be focusing our attention from an economic point of view?
Thank you, Nicole. There's never a shortage of news to talk about, and of course, I think the two big key items on the United States front is that we got our first taste of government official released data on jobless claims. And so this was a report that came out this morning for jobless claims for the week prior. We had already been talking about hints that this was going to be an absolute brutal jobless claims a record, and sure enough it was. The seasonally adjusted number that the media often quotes was around 3.2, 3.3 million new jobless claims last week alone. The official number is around 2.8 million, not seasonally adjusted. Either way, it was obviously a strong elevation, about 5 times the previous record of jobless claims in a single week that was set back with the last financial crisis. Of course, I think this explains the nature of this economic crisis is much different. Normally, you sort of ease into a recession, and sure, there's always that moment where the stock market, collapses and or some major economic event happens, but usually you have months or quarters of negative headwinds in the economy that precipitate this type of event, versus what we're seeing is the economic crisis kind of happening all at once in rapid real time, and that's obviously impacting how we analyze the situation and the differences between this and a normal recession, we should say, if there is such a thing. Of course, the other news on the positive side was that the federal government in the US stepped in with a stimulus package. Now, this was expected that they would come up with something. The fact that they did come up with something, locked down a deal, and is to the tune of around $2 trillion, does mean that this will certainly help cushion some of the blow of the economic ramifications of this shelter-in-place coronavirus epidemic. So some of this is pointed at individuals in receiving stimulus checks, and then parts of it are geared towards business loans, either for small, medium-sized businesses or larger corporations. So in a lot of ways, this looks like a standard federal government response, to the crisis, boosting up unemployment benefits and different things of that nature. In terms of our outlook, I would say this does not necessarily change our outlook that the US economy is in recession and will continue to be, and probably continue to be after in recession after even the health crisis subsides, due to the significance of the change to the economic landscape that we're seeing right now. However, it's not necessarily a bad thing that the federal government is stepping in and trying to cushion the blow and positively impact people's lives who are getting disrupted by this. So what's going to happen here with this new stimulus that came out? When we were looking for some anecdotal information, I liked this survey because it kind of put in context what would you do with if you received a payment, and we saw 33% would actually pay down debt and bills. And I think that's how we should be thinking about this, is that what the government can do is help try to get people down to a conservative basic standard of living. We don't want people losing their homes or being left out in the cold due to kind of a shelter in place where they might have some job disruption out of this event. But the reality is that people, it's a supply side and a demand side, right? And we've seen this in previous cash payouts by the government during times of crisis, is that during a time of crisis, people's inclinations are to basically keep the lights on, pay the bills, or save the money away, right? Because everybody naturally retreats to a more conservative position. What you see very low on the list is that this isn't going to be a boost to the stock market directly. People aren't going to invest these funds, and they're not going to spend it on discretionary items, right? It's not only is there not much opportunity to when you're sheltering in place at home, but in reality, that's the nature of these economic recessions, is that discretionary spending takes a hit. People pull back. They take a more conservative action, and we're going to see an entirely different consumer here over the next 6 months than we saw in the previous 6 months, where consumer sentiment was previously elevated. People were spending a lot of their after-tax income relatively on discretionary items versus basic goods. Now we're going to see that flipped all of a sudden, and any sort of cash stimulus is going to help people, just pay the bills and things of that nature. I think one of the bigger issues is how do businesses treat this recession, and that's one thing that we have been talking about is the large risk to the second half of the year. When we look beyond just the immediate months of shelter in place, is how are businesses going to be able to handle this? And this is where the health crisis and the economic crisis really tie together, because there's going to be a very large difference between shelter in place policy for 3 weeks or 3 months, or even 2 months or 1 month. If you look at this particular survey from Womply, you see that if you look at the 1 to 3 months range, how long small businesses could technically survive if sales stopped completely, you're talking about well over 50% of businesses could not last 3 months. Imagine the economic ramifications of that, and so even with the fact that over 20% say that they couldn't last less than 1 month, means that the clock is obviously ticking on us to control this pandemic and try to resume some sense of normalcy once this recession is done. I think either way, even 2 weeks into this contraction, businesses are going to come out of this a little bit damaged and bruised, and have to take a more conservative approach to the normal investments that they would or were planning on doing in 2020. They're going to really be taking a more conservative approach in order to try to build back up the balance sheet and try to resume business as normal. I think for many businesses, it's really about survival at this point. How do they best take care of their employees? How do they retain their employees? How do they keep the lights on? And how do they stay in business through a crisis like this that nobody was quite expecting in 2020 to happen? So I think those are some perspectives of where stimulus does help. I think the fact that some of this is aimed at small businesses and business loans is a positive, and the fact that there's direct cash payments we've seen is really a more effective economic measure than things like tax rebates or payroll tax cuts. So I think the government did a lot of positive things with the stimulus package. At the same time, we need to keep this in context that this does not mean that the U-shaped recession that we have been talking about, the slow recovery in the second half of the year, that projection does not go away. When we talk about our outlook, it remains the same as earlier this week, right? The stimulus just simply helps us go into that track. When people talk about things potentially spiraling into a Great Depression or worse, I think we need to take into account the fact that maybe back then, when we did see years and years periods where there was longer periods of economic contraction, which we call depression, that's when you didn't have a government that had the policies that they do now. So we've learned a lot since then, and we've changed our federal and fiscal policies a lot since the 1930s and prior. And this is part of the standard response, right? Is that government should step in, increase their debt loads in the near term in order to help stimulate the economy and cushion the blow. However, this does not eliminate the business cycle. We are still in a kind of an unprecedented event in many ways, and this is going to have some economic ramifications. Still plan on a weak second half of the year. However, the government stepping in is a positive for this entire event. So I think that concludes our summary. We're going to continue to keep you up to date, of course, as on a weekly basis as new events come along. But hope you're enjoying these reports, and I'll turn it back over to Nicole.
Thank you, Andrew. We appreciate this assessment. Unemployment issues are concerning, as well as understanding the real-world impact of the stimulus. So this does conclude this economic update. Our thoughts are with all of you and your families, as well as the many scientists and healthcare providers working on this health crisis. Stay tuned for our ongoing announcements and updates, and should anyone have any questions for our economists working within this fluid landscape, please feel free to contact us directly, and I will make sure that your inquiry is followed up. Thank you. Bye-bye.